Well, hello and welcome to Overdevest Nurseries. I'm David Wilson and I'm here in our testing and trialing garden on the nurseries. This is where we evaluate new varieties and test and compare them with existing varieties to make sure that they really are good performers for this region. That's the Mid-Atlantic and Northeastern states of the US. And a couple of years ago, here in this garden, I filmed a video entitled How to or Should You Prune Hydrangeas in Springtime. And at that point, I was dealing primarily with these lovely big white flowered hydrangeas, which of course are called panicle hydrangeas, and I went through and showed you how they flower on the current year's growth and how it's important to prune them in springtime so that you get all of this beautiful display with all of the gorgeous varieties that we can grow in our garden. And at that point I also mentioned that there's another type of hydrangea, and that's the Mophead hydrangea, sometimes known as the large leafed hydrangea, or botanically known as Hydrangea microphylla. And the reason that I mentioned that is that in that video I said you do not prune those in springtime because they are different. They flower on wood that was made the previous year. Some of the new varieties flower on old and new wood, and if you want to find out more about those, then I'd suggest that you check out some of the other videos here on this channel and you'll be able to find out about each of the individual varieties. But in general, it's important to say that this type of hydrangea, which produces these lovely big round dome-shaped flower heads, which can be either white or pink or blue or red and sometimes purple as well. These are the ones that grow out during the summer months. They set their flower bud right in the apex of the little shoot that then goes through the autumn time, goes through the winter, and in springtime starts to grow out and then flowers in the early part of the summer. And if you were to prune those in springtime, you're effectively cutting off these flowers, and of course you don't want to do that. So that's why I said you do not prune these types in springtime. Certainly the big white panicle hydrangeas, and they will respond very well to that, but these types you don't do. And unfortunately, sometimes when I'm visiting people's gardens, I see that they mistakenly prune them back in springtime and then unfortunately don't get many flowers and sometimes none at all. And in that video, when I was talking about these, I said the time to prune them is not in spring but rather in summer, when the flowers are just beginning to go over. And then I said I will come back, I promised I would come back and show you how to prune these types of hydrangeas. But let me say right at the outset that if you've got a plant like this, and incidentally this is Hydrangea microphylla, the variety is together, and this is an absolutely gorgeous double flowered one, as you see, that's putting on a terrific show. And I'll tell you right now, this plant does not need pruning. But I recognize that sometimes there are ones that perhaps outgrow the position, perhaps they're older, they're losing some of their vigor, a bit like this plant over here. This is Hydrangea Endless Summer. It's a plant that's now been in here probably at least 10 years. About 3 weeks ago, this was an absolute picture, covered with lots of flowers, and it's still in good order, but you'll see that it's now starting to really, I suppose, show its age, a bit like some of the rest of us. But anyway, to try and get this one rejuvenated again, there's a way to prune it, and that's what I thought I would do today, would be to take you and show you how I treat this type of hydrangea now in summertime, just when the flowers, as you see, are fading, and yet, and this is very important, leave the longest possible time for the rest of the summer and autumn for the new growth to grow out and then produce those valuable flower buds in the tips of the shoots, which of course then will go through the autumn time and then rebloom and flower again in the springtime. So that's what we're going to do. Now let me quickly add that if you have a hydrangea at home that isn't flowering and has never really flowered well, has put on plenty of growth but hasn't flowered, pruning it will probably not help it that much. It will encourage it to make new, fresh, vigorous growth, but it's probably not going to help it get into a flowering mode. If it's not flowering, there's probably something else going on, and that's where I would refer you to another video that's here on this channel, which is entitled "Why Isn't My Hydrangea Flowering?" because in there I explain the reasons why sometimes varieties are not flowering in people's gardens, and also I mention some possible remedies and things you can do with it. And also I would say that if you've got a plant that's outgrowing its position, maybe it's time to think about moving it and giving it a ride in the wheelbarrow. You see, hydrangeas like this do normally transplant well. So if you happen to have it in a small spot somewhere, then it would be good to dig a good generous sized root ball and then move it somewhere in the garden where you have more space for it to grow. And of course, when you go and visit some of our partnering garden centres, be sure to look out now for some of the shorter, more compact varieties that might be a better fit for the size that you have. Anyway, let's assume that you have a plant like this that's now beginning to look a little tired. It could do with some renovation, it could do with some thinning out, and that's what we're going to do now with this plant. And remember, if there's nothing else that you remember from this video, the one thing is that you prune this type of hydrangea in summertime when the flowers are just going over and not in spring. Okay, well, now that I've flogged that message a bit hard, let me show you what I do with this type of hydrangea. The first is I go in winter time, and that's where I go in to the center of the plant, and this is when there's no leaves on the plant, so it's easy to do it, and I take out all of the old dead shoots from the center. So this is something you could do in the winter time. I'm not suggesting that you do any pruning to the tops of it, but certainly go in and break out these old shoots. If you want, you could use a pair of pruners, but these are now so brittle that really if you just reach into the middle, you can see the old flower shoots there, and these stems have been probably dead for several years, and you just take them out, and taking those out helps really to give a little bit more air into the center of the plant, certainly cleans it up a little bit, and winter or early spring is a good time to do that. So that's the first thing to do. I like to do this in the winter time or early spring because then you don't have the leaves and it's easier to do, and there's probably a little bit more time there too if you get a good day to work on. So that's the first thing to do. Then the second thing that I like to do is take a look at the plants in the early part of the summer, and at that time you'll often see shoots like this one here, where the tip of the shoot has died back, or in this case the remains of the old flower from last year, it's on the tip, and you can go in and you can just trim that out. So that's a very kind of cosmetic light pruning thing that you can do, and if you're a little tentative about pruning them, you can certainly do both of those things. You'll do your plant a lot of good, and you won't have to worry about doing anything wrong. So that's nice and simple and easy to do. That's stage 2. So we've taken out the old dead shoots from the center of the plant. We've trimmed back any dead tips that were on the shoots. The next thing is to look into the middle of the plant here and see if there's any crossing branches that are crossing over and rubbing against each other. Now, right now in this plant here, as I look at it, most of them are reasonably well spaced out and cascading from the center out towards the tips. But I do see one in here that's coming from here and going out into the rest of the plant. So that'll be one that you just reach in and cut that out from near the bottom. The idea is to try and leave it so that there's plenty of room for each of these shoots to develop. So you go in, dead wood, then any dead tips, and then any crossing shoots. Now, if you look carefully at the plant, you'll see that there's two different types of shoots here. First, you'll see these ones, these soft, bright green shoots, and these obviously are just freshly grown ones. So that's those. But then look here and you'll see that there's a darker kind of brown or grey shoot, and those are obviously the older, woodier ones. And those are the ones that we're going to trim. We're going to leave, for the time being at least, these bright, juicy green ones here and let those come on up. But these ones that are here with this grey colour on them, they're the ones that we're going to work on right now. So it's quite easy to tell them apart. The young, juicy green shoots that are coming up from the center of the plant tends to be here, growing up and pushing through the middle of the plant, and they're quite rigid and strong, whereas the ones that have the brown grey colour on it here that are woodier are the ones that have all the heavy flower heads on the tip, and they tend to fall over, and so they are the ones that we're going to shorten back. So let me show you this in a little bit more detail. If you look here, you'll see there is the old wood, the grey shoot that's come up from the center. It's extended out, it's got all the flowers here on the tips, and what I'm doing is going back about a third to this point here. Can you see there? And that's where there's two shoots breaking at that point, and with the pruners I just go in and I snip that out at that point, getting rid of the old flowers that are on there and leaving these young growths here which are green and juicy, as you see. But what I'm going to do is to shorten them back, and if I look at this one here, you'll see that there's 1, 2, 3, and then the flower head. And what I'm going to do is to come up from the base, from the stem that's there, and just trim this back, leaving about 2 sets of buds. And here's the same on this one, 1, 2. So I'm just trimming that back at that point, and then I'm doing exactly the same here with this shoot too. So here is a better explanation as to what I've done. As you see, I've trimmed the grey shoot here back at this point, removed about a third of the growth off, and then when that was gone, here's the 3 green shoots that I was talking about, and I cut those back to about 2 or 3 sets of buds in each case, and now there's buds here in the axils of these leaves that are going to grow out, and those are the ones that are going to form the new flowers. Now, it's a little difficult to see inside the plant with the shadows and movement and so on. So what I'm going to do is to cut out this shoot here in its entirety and imagine that it's still growing to the plant. So let me remove that, and as you see, here it is now, that hopefully you'll be able to get a better understanding as to how I'm approaching this pruning work. So here's the grey stems that I was talking about, the older shoots, and then here are the green shoots that I was talking about. So imagine this piece here is in the ground and it's growing up and has, as you see, these flowers that are now going over. So the first thing I do is to go back about a third or so from the top of the plant, and that would take me back either to this point or also to this point here. And because these are two nice green juicy shoots here, I think I'm probably going to shorten those back to that point. So imagine this is still growing in the plant, and imagine then that I'm going to cut this back. You always trim just above a joint. When you do that, the tissue here is what they call lignified. It's harder there, so there's less opportunity for dieback, for disease to enter and so on. So you usually trim just above a leaf joint like it is here. And then what I'm doing is trimming these secondary shoots, which are the green juicy ones that are here. And there is one set of buds, there's two. So I'm going to trim that one back to there. Here's another set of buds, there's one, there's two. So I'm going to trim that back to there. And then, because it has more shoots on the stem, I'm going to do the same here. There's one, there's two, so I'm trimming that one back. And then here are two more shoots that are further down the stem, and I'm going to trim those back again to about 2 or possibly 3 shoots, or 2 or 3 buds from the base of where the stem is. So if you can imagine this growing inside the plant, that's what I'm doing with all of these shoots. So the last thing to do is to just go around and shorten back any of the thin spindly growths that are still remaining on the plant. Any of these thin drawn up shoots that have been kind of misshapen and thin and whippy, those can be shortened back, and then you leave these strong vigorous growths here, because those are the ones that are obviously going to grow out and produce lots of flowers and stronger growth into the rest of this summer growing season. And just to recap, the first thing that we did was went in and removed the old dead shoots out of the inside of the plant. So clean that out. You can do it now at this time of year, though this is a job that I usually do during the winter or the early part of the spring. Then the second thing is, in early summer, when the new leaves and growths have all emerged, you might find some dead shoots on the tips of these shoots, and that's the time to go in after you see lots of nice young strong growth and just snip those off, because they're dead anyway, so you might as well get rid of that. And then if you want to prune your Mophead hydrangeas, or these macrophyllus as they're called, you do that as soon as possible when the flowers are beginning to go over. I'm doing this here now in early July, but I know from past experience in this region you can do it a little later than that, into mid or perhaps even the end of July. But the critical thing is to do it as soon as possible, because then that leaves the longest possible time for these growths to settle down and produce the little embryonic flower bud, which overwinters in the tips of the shoots and then grows out next year to produce the flowers. So that's essentially why you do this pruning in the summertime and not in spring. Then I went through and reduced the old grey shoots, the older branches, took about a third off the top of them, and then trimmed back the secondary growths that were on here that were branching from those stems, and trim those back to about 2 or 3 sets of buds, which means that then they will grow out now, and they in turn will produce more flower buds in the tips of those shoots. And we might even, because this is a good remontant variety, we might even get a flush of flowers on this plant going into the autumn time too. But for most of the varieties out there, they're carrying their flowers during the winter time in those embryonic flower buds, so that's why you prune now in the summertime. So if you want to, you can reduce the height of the plant too by going in and then shortening back some of these shoots if you want to. You just go in and trim off the tops of the shoots. Don't go down too far. Probably in this case about 2 or 3 sets of buds on the stems. That will help to reduce the overall size of the plant. But because I have plenty of room here and there's no restraints on the size that this plant gets, I'm probably just going to leave most of those. So that's really, if you want to, how you can go about pruning your hydrangea, macrophyllus or mophead hydrangeas. The critical thing, remember, is do it in the summer and leave the longest possible time for them to grow out and set flower buds for next year. This is David Wilson. Enjoy your gardening. It's good for us and it's good for our environment too.